Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle Podcast. I'm Daniel Watkins, and today's episode continues our exploration of the Tudor period to hear about one of the most famous figures in not just Tudor history, but perhaps all of British history, Anne Boleyn. The second wife of King Henry VIII, Anne also has a few connections to Alnwick Castle. Firstly, due to her relationship with Henry Percy, who later became the 6th Earl of Northumberland, and who played a role in several key moments in Anne's life, but secondly, because the Alnwick Castle archives hold a copy of the Ecclesiastes, a religious book with links to Anne. Rarely seen on public display, this year the book will be shown at Hever Castle in Kent as part of a major new exhibition all about Anne Boleyn. To find out more, we spoke to two Tudor experts, Natalie Grueninger, host of the Talking Tudors podcast, and Dr. Owen Emmerson, author, historical consultant, and assistant curator at Hever. Here is our conversation. Please enjoy. We are very happy to be joined on this Tudor-themed episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast by Natalie Grueninger and Owen Emmerson. Hello, thank you both for joining us. How are you both?
Very well, thank you so much for having us.
It's an absolute joy to be on with you. Thank you for having us. It's very exciting to be with you.
And it's very exciting to be talking about Anne Boleyn and some of her connections with the Percy family and Alnwick Castle with you. And she's a person that so many people are still interested in hundreds of years later. And I guess I've probably got to start by asking, what makes Anne Boleyn special and interesting to you?
Yes, absolutely. This is a question that I get asked often, and I think I always come up with different responses. So, I think there's a number of reasons why Anne's story is so fascinating, so compelling, and I think partly it is that it has all the elements of an incredibly compelling story. So, before becoming a sort of Tudor historian, I was a teacher and had to teach, how to write really engaging stories, and this story has them all. It has that compelling hook. It's got an incredibly engaging protagonist who's also quite flawed and complex. The surrounding characters are fascinating, the incredible setting, the tension, the conflict. It literally ticks all of those boxes. And of course, then the tragic ending on top of everything else. And I think there's also an element of the unknown. I think Owen will probably agree with me that there's a lot about Anne that is still debated, still unknown, a big chunk of her life that we basically have no direct evidence for. And I think that makes her tantalizing. She inspires people to go in search of answers, to try and find the real Anne there. And then before I hand over to Owen, one more thing, I think there is something quite special about Anne. I think there's an ineffable quality about her that makes her compelling. The same as there might be people today that attract a lot of attention and people are interested in their story and their lives. I think Anne had that quality that just makes enemies not want to stop looking at her. Loyal people want to see what she's doing. Everybody's watching her. So yeah, there are a few things for me.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. There is so much information about her, but also there are those large gaps in which I think people are able to come up with their own conclusions. They're able to explore in those gaps. And therefore, I think there are many different versions of her for people to explore. It's not just one narrative. She has been many different things to many different people over time. So there are the primary sources, there is the Anne of history, but there are also other Annes which have emerged for different reasons over time. She was recast in her daughter's reign into a very potent political and religious symbol. And then she became a tragic heroine in the Victorian era, quite a beautiful one too, quite removed from what her contemporaries said of her. So, there's sort of the sky's the limit with Anne Boleyn because there's an Anne for all seasons, really.
The Anne that we're probably most interested in at Alnwick Castle is an Anne before she becomes queen, before she gets involved with Henry VIII, because she has a connection of some form with Henry Percy, who goes on to become the 6th Earl of Northumberland. What can you tell us about Anne's relationship with Percy and what you think may or may not have happened in the years before she married Henry VIII?
Yes, I think I might start just by saying that, as I mentioned earlier, there is very little direct evidence for Anne's movements, for her life between the sort of years that we're interested in here, say 1522 to 1527. But the principal story for the Percy connection is actually a biography by a man called George Cavendish, who served as gentleman usher to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Now, he wrote this in the sort of middle to late 1550s, so obviously quite a lot after Anne's death, and it was widely circulated in manuscript form to begin with. And it's in this manuscript that we get this suggestion of a connection between a romantic connection, I should say, between Percy and Anne, and it's thought to have sort of happened around 1523. But we do also have some contemporary evidence to I suppose, back up the fact that it does appear there was something that went on with them. And that's at the time of Anne's fall. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, is writing about Anne's fall. And he basically says, even if it hadn't been for the adultery, if that hadn't been discovered, and this is a quote, he says, there were witnesses testifying that a marriage past 9 years before had been made and fully consummated between her and the Earl of Northumberland. Now, this is 1536, so if we do the maths, we're in 1527, which I think is probably too late for the romance still to be going on. But I think what it does suggest is that that's probably when Henry and Anne's relationship got serious. And this is certainly what Owen and I have been arguing recently, that it is the summer of 1527. Because Chapuis arrives at court in 1529. So if this seemed plausible to him that Anne had been with Henry Percy, I should say, just a couple of years before, I think that shows that the Henry VIII and Anne match wasn't really in full swing until a little bit later. So it is really interesting. And we also, of course, have Percy's own wife. He ends up getting married to a woman called Mary Talbot. Disastrous marriage, unfortunately. They're both so unhappy. And when they become separated in 1532, she actually says that he told her that he'd actually been engaged, I suppose you could say, to Anne Boleyn. But I should say that they both deny it. Anne and Henry Percy both completely denied that ever happened. But according to the Cavendish story, it's a great story. He's a member of Wolsey's household. They regularly visit the Queen, as in Catherine of Aragon. Anne is serving Catherine, Percy, and Anne Boleyn. They start talking. They enjoy each other's company. Owen, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Cavendish's story has sort of become the basis for the early romance of Anne Boleyn. And also, very importantly, I think in later narratives about her life, this is the moment where she could have been happy. Do you know what I mean? It's the moment where love was thwarted. And popular culture generally attributes this interruption of her love life to Henry VIII. But actually, that's not what Cavendish says. He suggests that Anne and Percy have formed an attraction, that love has grown between them, and that Wolsey essentially intervenes on the part of propriety, because Anne is a woman of status, certainly. Father Thomas Boleyn is the Earl-in-waiting to Ormond, but Henry Percy is a cut above, let's face it. And marriage at this time is an absolutely political and dynastic arrangement. And Wolsey is essentially intervening here because this is not a arranged marriage, it's a love match. And I just want to stress that in the 16th century, marriage was rarely founded upon love. It was typically a dynastic choice. Love was expected in marriage, but it was rarely the foundation for it. And that is what we're seeing here in Cavendish's account. It's essentially that, both Northumberland and Anne Boleyn have sort of gone against the established principle for why marriages of people of their rank are formed. And we see, Wolsey breaking the news to Henry Percy in this account, giving him a good dressing down, telling him that he needs to be disciplined. And Percy defends his love for Anne in Cavendish's account. He says, "In this matter, I have gone so far for so many worthy witnesses that I know not how to avoid myself, nor to discharge my conscience." And essentially, in this account, both of them are threatened, especially Percy, including disinheritance, which, is the ultimate sort of punishment.
Because in this account, Wolsey basically tells Percy's dad what's going on. And this is the present Earl of Northumberland, Henry the Magnificent, who gives him an even worse dressing down and says, "I thank God I have other sons."
It must have been hugely humiliating. And you can kind of see why later in life that it's not an area of his life that he likes to revisit, and probably is quite concerned at times when this affair is brought up, particularly during the downfall of Anne Boleyn. This could have been, explosive stuff for the Northumberlands and for the Percys. This really could have gone in another direction. And, instead of Anne falling alongside 5 men, we might have seen something perhaps as dramatic, but involving Henry Percy, the concealment of a prior marriage of the Queen of England. But that isn't the way the wind blew. Percy's attachment to Anne was broken. And I think this has become sort of the moral aspect of Anne Boleyn's story in other retellings. This is the moment where Henry did something wrong, if that makes sense, where he intervened into true love, and it's become a really, really potent part of the mythology of Anne Boleyn.
The suggestion by the Percy family historian Edward Barrington de Fonblanc, who's writing the Annals of the House of Percy in the Victorian period, his emphasis seems to be on the fact that at the time this is happening, the arrangement for young Percy to marry Mary Talbot was already in place. So chances are, whether it was love or not, things couldn't have ever gone that way. I don't know how difficult it might have been to break off a marriage arranged between. She was the daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, I think, and
She was, yeah.
That seems like something that you wouldn't have been able to get out of, no matter who you might have fallen in love with.
Yeah, that's such a good point, actually, because I do think that marriage was sort of being arranged in around 1518, if I'm not incorrect. I think I remember Professor Eric Ives also pointing that out. So this was clearly something that, had been spoken about for quite a long time, which is really interesting. Another point maybe just to add has to do with the annulment that Henry seeks. When he does seek to marry Anne, he needs an annulment, obviously. And in that, there's a little line that's very interesting. And it says that it allows Henry to marry a woman. It doesn't name Anne. We don't know who the woman is, but it's quite obvious that it was Anne, who'd already contracted marriage with some other person, provided she had not consummated it. And this is, of course, what Percy and Anne both swear to under oath, especially Percy's put under quite a lot of pressure when, Henry's wanting to marry Anne. But he swears under oath that they'd actually never been engaged in the first place. But it's interesting that line is inserted. Now, we don't know. This might actually have to do with another romantic connection that Anne has, with the Butler family, or perhaps someone that we don't know about. But it was certainly there to cover anything that may have happened before their marriage, which is quite interesting.
So it starts quite well for the two of them. It very quickly goes downhill. And there doesn't appear really to have been very much contact, if any, between Percy and Anne until potentially they see each other again right at the very end of her life, because Percy, now the Earl of Northumberland in 1536, is one of the male peers selected to effectively proclaim her guilty and condemn her to death. But he himself doesn't actually do that himself. So according to the Venetian ambassador at the time, he takes ill and has to be removed from the courtroom before the guilty verdict is announced. What's your take on the Percy and the Northumberland involvement, and how fair a trial Anne may or may not have had right at the end?
Ooh, how long do you have on this podcast? Owen, do you want to start?
Yeah, in terms of how fair Anne's trial was, this was never meant to be a fair trial. And actually, if we look at Tudor justice, I don't know how we could frame it as such, even if they tried, because Anne largely is unaware of what the charges are before she enters the courtroom. She has no legal defence whatsoever. That is her duty. She is to defend herself. And considering that Henry has almost certainly ordered a French executioner before this date, I think that sort of sets the tone for how much justice is going to be delivered to Anne Boleyn in this moment. This is a formal process, and the decision has already been made, essentially. And I think that any king who orders the peers of the realm to sit in judgment upon his wife is sending a message that none of them can mistake, and that is that he wants her dead. And Henry Percy is one of the 26 peers in the realm that sits in judgment on Anne, but he becomes incredibly ill during the trial. And of course, we know that he's going to die in 1537. I don't think we can overlook the fact that this must have been quite an emotionally challenging thing for him to do. We've touched upon the fact that although it's not entirely certain what kind of affection existed between them, that there was this early attachment, and having to sit upon judgment upon the woman that you once intended to marry must have been an appalling task. And actually, he has to be removed from the courtroom and is unable to take part in George Boleyn's trial, which happens thereafter. So this must have been emotionally challenging on a couple of fronts, I think, not least because there was that caveat in the petition to the Pope that Anne could have married Henry, provided that she had not consummated a union with anyone else. Well, Henry Percy is one of the contenders of the possibility of that consummation because she had this emotional attachment. So yeah, I think in this moment he must have been experiencing an enormous amount of fear. There is a possibility that other people might be drawn into this, and his connection to the Queen must have been troubling for him. The 17th of May in 1536, Anne's marriage to Henry is actually declared null and void. And there is a reference made to, and I quote, certain just true and lawful impediments unknown at the making of the marriage. So again, even in the formal process, there are hints here that the foundation for the annulment of the marriage of the Queen of England to the King might have been made on the basis that there was a pre-contract to Henry Percy. So this must have been a terrifying time, don't you think, Natalie?
I do, yes, absolutely. I think you've covered all the main points there, but I agree that I think fear must have been a predominant emotion in Percy. I think sometimes this episode is romanticized quite heavily. The story is so often read backwards, as we know, and because we have the account of George Cavendish, which isn't published, I should say, until the 17th century. People start to imagine this great love affair between them, and of course that he's heartbroken, and that's why he collapses. But we do know that Henry Percy had suffered from lots of health conditions, and was really unwell and had a pretty unhappy life. I have to say, he didn't get on with any of his family pretty much, and had an awful relationship with his wife. So poor Percy, I sort of feel for him a little bit. But yes, it's very interesting that how the case is said to be that there was an impediment. So you wonder if Anne has confessed to perhaps something more physical having happened between them? Is that what the impediment is? Because the annulment obviously allowed for there to have been a pre-contract as long as it hadn't been consummated. But I should also just say that there are theories that it wasn't the Percy situation at all, that was the impediment. So we don't know for certain, unfortunately.
We've talked a little bit about how Anne could have been happy if this was a romantic attachment and she maybe became the Countess of Northumberland. So I would maybe like to do some historical speculation and wonder what might have happened had Anne Boleyn become Countess of Northumberland. Mary Talbot's out of the equation. Henry VIII still has his situation with Catherine of Aragon, but Anne Boleyn is no longer the solution. How different might things have been had we had a happy Percy marriage up at Alnwick in the late 1520s, early 1530s, instead of what ended up happening?
Yeah, it would have been incredibly different. Absolutely. And I think we all want that for Anne, don't we? We want her to have had that. I don't know about you, Anne, but I think had Anne had that position, and we all know that Percy gets ill and dies in 1537. I hope this doesn't sound awful, but Anne would have then been an incredibly wealthy and powerful widow. And this is when women really kind of blossom in this period. We've seen Bess of Hardwicke and all other women. So I think possibly we could have seen an Anne, going on with translating books and texts, for example, going on to do what, let's say, Catherine Parr does. Had she been given that space, I think she was raised to be running a very large household. She certainly had the skills for it. She knew absolutely how to do all of it. I think she would have excelled in running a household and being countess. And I think, there would have been lots of lovely things in her story had it not been for Henry, of course. What do you think, Owen?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think we would have had a much happier ending to Anne Boleyn's life than certainly manifested when she became queen. I think you're totally right, provided that, Percy dies in 1537, still in our alternate history. I think she would have actually wielded perhaps more power than actually materialized when she became queen. I think Anne did wield enormous power, but perhaps more so before she was queen, during that prolonged and protracted period during the Great Matter, where she was actively involved in pulling the political strings and having enormous influence. Everything changed when she became queen, because all of a sudden, all of the pressure transferred to her, and her ability to provide Henry with this very narrow happiness window of providing a son. And all of the power that she wielded after that was contingent upon that delivery of a son. So I think she would have been much, much happier. I think she would have excelled as a countess, because all of her upbringing was in the train of very powerful queens. I think she would have wielded enormous influence. I think she would have served loyally at court. And I think we would have had a very, very interesting legacy too. Not to undermine the legacy that she has now, but I think all of her potential was stunted by Henry's excessive desires.
I think we're all agreed we would have liked a happy ending up in Northumberland for Anne. But her connection with Northumberland and with Alnwick didn't end with her death. It didn't end with the sixth Earl's death, because several centuries later, Elizabeth Percy, the first Duchess of Northumberland, purchases a prayer book with connections to Anne Boleyn. And this is how this podcast episode has come about, with a trip to our archives you made to have a look at this prayer book. What can you tell us about what you saw in the castle archives?
Oh goodness, this is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen and ever held, to be honest, connected with Anne. Such a special moment, and to be there with my wonderful friend Owen was absolutely incredible. I thought maybe we could just start with a little bit of context. So it's the Ecclesiastes. It's one of the books of the Hebrew Bible and part of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. So this is what this manuscript is that we're talking about. But it's a very interesting manuscript, But I just thought in order to kind of understand the source book for this manuscript, we might need to go back a little bit before sort of Anne's time. So the Ecclesiastes is very interesting in that only a few reformers, I suppose you would say, actually comment on this book in the 16th century, which is a little odd. And that's because some of the ideas perhaps contradict some of the ideas that perhaps Protestants or people that you might call Lutherans believe. So that probably explains that. But the book Ecclesiastes basically preaches that all is vanity. So on the sort of surface level, and we see this in the title page of Anne's beautiful manuscript says, all is vanity, preaching that all things without God is vanity. All men be vain, which have not the knowledge of God. So 3 reformers do comment on this particular book, and they are Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, and Johannes Brenz. Now, all these men are connected, the 3 of them. The latter 2 are followers or students, you could even say, of Martin Luther. So this is a very tight circle. But what's really interesting is that Martin Luther in the 1520s actually puts forward a completely new and very controversial interpretation of Ecclesiastes. This goes completely against the sort of medieval and patristic interpretation that was dominated by this theme of contemptus mundi, contempt of the world and of all worldly things. So it's very interesting. And it was originally, I suppose, this text was interpreted as a call to the monastic life, really as a call to not engage with worldly things, to kind of lock yourself away from the world because everything's vanity. So that was the traditional. But then Martin Luther, he actually decides to not look at the text that's in the Vulgate, which is, the sort of version of the Bible, the Latin version that has been around since the 4th century. It's what everyone generally refers to. But Luther decides that he's going to go back to the Hebrew text. And this is what a lot of sort of reformers are doing at this point. They're going back to the original. And he sees that there are things that diverge in that text. And he, in fact, lectures on the Ecclesiastes in 1526. Now, this isn't published until 1532, but what's really interesting is that his interpretation is then commented on in a published commentary by a man called Johannes Brenz, who basically agrees with most of what Luther's saying, not everything. But this is published in German in 1528, and it's the first sort of published commentary to defend Luther's new controversial interpretation of Ecclesiastes. And Brenz had access to the original sort of lecture notes and all sorts of things that Luther gave. But basically, here's a little summary of Brenz's idea, and this is important, I'll tell you why in a moment. He says, in short, all creatures, namely riches, honor, power, joy, pleasure, health, and other things are very good and gifts of God. But because man is so very corrupt and ruined because of sin, they are to him a vain and empty thing and can give him no satisfaction. So basically, the controversial argument is that it's not the things that are bad. These are gifts from God. It's the abuse of these things by humans and the sin. So that's Brenz's commentary in German in 1528. But then along comes another man called Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples. He's a theologian. He's a leading figure in French humanism. Anne knows several of his works. He publishes a French translation, sorry, I know it's a bit convoluted, of Brenz's commentary in around 1531. Now, this is very important because it's a copy of this commentary that finds its way to England, clearly in the hands of the Boleyns or someone close to them, and it's this book that becomes the source book for Anne's manuscript. And it still survives, that copy, by the way, in the British Library. And the other, I guess, important thing to note before we look maybe more carefully at Anne's actual book is that Lefebvre dies a Roman Catholic. So I think what is really interesting about this is we have Anne, who dies an English Catholic. We have Lefebvre d'Etaples, who dies a Roman Catholic. We have, of course, Martin Luther, who's as Lutheran as you can sort of get. And these people are all commenting and looking at and reflecting on the same scriptural text. So what I think this does beautifully is it complicates the narrative of the reformer in this period, which is incredibly fluid. It's a very individual journey. You know, it's not a one-way street either. People are sort of a few steps forward, 5 steps back kind of thing. They're reflecting on they're thinking, they're digesting. It's a period of revolution. It's a religious revolution. So I think it's interesting to keep that in mind when we're thinking about this. So maybe, Owen, maybe you might want to talk a little bit about why, if Anne is a fluent French speaker, because I think this is quite fascinating, would a book be translated into English? Because I think what I didn't specify is that the biblical text in Anne's manuscript is in French, but the commentary, so that commentary based on Brenz's work, is translated from the French into English. And I think it's interesting to think about why that may be.
Yeah, no, definitely so. And you've outlined that so beautifully and brought something really important to the table in that how meaningless the labels we attach to these people actually are, and how unhelpful they are, because they really mask the evolution that is going on. I love what you said there about this being a period of religious revolution, and it's that people are evolving through it, and they are, as Hilary Mantel said, sort of walking blindly into the dark with these feelings, these ideas, these contradictions, and they're working things out at a time of increasing danger and scrutiny as well. Now, as to why it is translated into English, is that one of the sort of core points of mystery around this book, I suppose, because we don't know precisely who commissioned this work. And that question as to who was responsible for its commission might help explain why this is not in French, but why instead it is in English. Now, it's possible that Anne herself might have commissioned this work. James Carley suggests it's a conscious program of transformation and elevation. And Anne, of course, is fluent in French, so why is this provided in English commentary? And again, according to Carley, he states that apart from their iconographic function, this would have been to provide pious material for Anne to read and to discuss with her ladies. Now, this is such an important point that he brings to the table, because one of the things that we know about Anne Boleyn is that she actively encourages those around her to engage with her books, her texts. She leaves open, for example, a copy of the Bible in English for her ladies to read from. They would read aloud to her. So actually, perhaps this does speak to the fact that this is a communal text within her community, might be more accessible therefore to them. But I have to say the experience of sitting with Natalie for a good number of hours, I can't remember exactly how long we were there for, but we pored over this book for a good amount of time. Has to be one of the most exciting days of my life, I think. We were continually pinching ourselves. And I also, before we go on to talk about the contents of this book, which I think is extraordinary and exceptional, I think if you really want to understand how Anne Boleyn thought about herself, her power, her faith, and her legacy, this book, this little gem of a book, might be actually the closest voice that she left behind, because it says everything you need to know about her, in my opinion.
It's not just the words that have fascinated people, the imagery, the symbols, the heraldry that appear within it as well, that have fascinated people, even taking out the religious aspect of it. And that seems to really firm up that connection that this was a book that would have been Anne's.
This is perhaps one of the most beautiful books of Anne that I think survives, and it contains Flemish art illuminations throughout the work, which are executed in the most exceptional way. One of the things that really struck me as we were going through the text was how clean it is. And I think this speaks to the fact that it was probably delivered to Anne in the final years of her life, actually quite late in her life, I would suggest. When I say clean, I mean that it doesn't show enormous sign of haptic wear, which essentially the traces of the oils in our hands, which are transferred to paper, not just through turning the pages and reading with one's fingers, as it were, but also through devotion. The kissing of images and, the touching of them was very much a evidence practice in the 16th century. So although there's a visual DNA of here, I don't necessarily think that a lot of her DNA is left behind. And I think that is purely a reflection of the fact that this was delivered very late in her life before her tragic downfall. What do you think, Natalie?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. There are a few fingerprints on it, and I remember thinking, "Oh, I wonder if this could be Anne's." But that might be a bit of a stretch. But we can all imagine. But I think certainly Owen and I are looking at this period in time. We're always researching Anne's reign, and I think what has become quite obvious very recently only is that there does appear to be an effort by Anne, I would say from around the beginning of 1535, to really shore up her position. Things aren't going that well for her. In my book, sorry to plug it, but The Final Year of Anne Boleyn, I look at the last 18 months, and that's for a reason. Anne's downfall doesn't begin in May 1536. It doesn't begin in January 1536. It begins much earlier than that, which is why I do look at that longer period. And so I think that this may be part of that effort to legitimize Anne's claim, to shore up her position. And it's just such a wonderful survival, I think. Beautiful, as Owen said, but also just to touch on a point that you made earlier about the fact that this is a gorgeous book to look at, because books in this period have a dual function. Yes, they are there for spiritual, to nurture your sort of spiritual side, to teach, as Anne was certainly doing with her ladies. But they're also gorgeous objects. They're artworks in themselves. And I know that when we got our hands on this, we couldn't believe it. It's in its original binding. This to me was just amazing. Although the black velvet is now sort of faded to a bit of a grey brown, this is the original, beautiful, stunning binding. Possibly connections to Cornelius Hayes with the actual binding and the clasps that are on it. Maybe even a connection to Hans Holbein in terms of designs of those clasps. So this is absolutely exquisite. And we also know, thanks to the work of Susan James, that this is almost certainly the work of Gerard Horenbout, which again is incredible. We know the Horenbouts are connected to Anne at court. We know they're working for her. But this has his initials. One of the illustrations actually has his initials, which for a long time was thought to be the sigma, the Greek sigma. But Susan James has convincingly argued that this is the work of Gerard Horenbout. So there are so many incredible things about this manuscript, the content, the insights it gives us into Anne's interior life, but then also her appreciation of the object, the book, and that I think is a nod to her sophistication, her elegance, her love of luxury, and all of this she's learned on the continent. So it's multifaceted. I think that's why we're so in love with it anyway.
I think you're so right. This really is. It's not just an expression of her identity. It's an expression of her role as a patron. And we know that the Horenbouts are a very, very important part of her network. They create several works for her. They almost certainly painted her too. And when you spoke about the beautiful binding and those bosses that are on the front, they are quite exceptional. One of the, her arms sit right in the centre combined with Henry's, but the most beautiful aspect of one of those bosses was that beautiful rendering of her falcon, which again we see illuminated inside. And I'm sure we're going to go on and touch upon her iconography. But you're so right, those clasps, very, very distinctive of the work of Hans Holbein the Younger, another key person in her patronage sort of collection, and also I don't think we can rule out the fact that Cornelius Hayes may well have been the executor of this gold work, because it is created on an exceptional level. So this really does give us such an important window into one of her primary functions as queen, as a patron of the arts, and this is such a redolent expression of that.
You've touched on this a little bit already, but as historians, what does it feel like to look at that book and see her falcon realised on the page, to be able to look through these pages that have such a strong connection with somebody that you've spent so much of your time learning about, thinking about, and just almost being there with them? How does that actually feel for you on a personal level?
It's incredibly powerful. I have to say, this is, having that time with this book and being there with Owen, we both share this passion. I know I've certainly been studying Anne's life for 25 years. That's a huge chunk of my life, and to hold something that I do think she held. I agree with Owen. I think it came quite late in the piece, but I think she certainly saw it and held it, possibly prayed with it, all these things that you sort of start thinking about. It's a very tangible link to her. I think objects can be portals to the past, to be honest with you. And I think when, you sit there and you hold this, as we did, it is a direct connection to Anne, but not just to Anne. I think we sort of, I don't think we mentioned, Owen, earlier, that it's almost certainly the translation is the work of George Boleyn. It fits in with other work he's doing for Anne at this point. So as, Boleyn supporters as we are, to have this link to both of them, to sort of see George's work, which he actually alludes to on the scaffold. He talks about setting forth the word of God. This is what he's talking about. This is exactly what he's talking about. These are the sorts of activities that men of George's station and reformed-minded people are doing. They are translating texts. They are reflecting on them. They're thinking about them. So it's a connection to Anne, but it's a connection to the Boleyns, I think, as a whole for me, because it took 100 years for the Boleyns to get to this point, to have one of theirs on the throne. So I feel like it's a real culmination. And as you sort of touched on, there are 12 stunning illuminations in the book. This is a record of Anne's royal iconography. Everything that you've sort of pieced together from other places, they're all here. Everything's here. It's a wonderful record. And it makes a very strong political statement too. Of course, this is Anne, the legitimate Queen of England, the only wife of Henry VIII. And so all of that together is incredibly powerful. It's all embodied in this beautiful manuscript, and you're touching the original pages. So for me, it was incredibly special.
Yeah, I have to say it was a very moving, emotional moment, not least because I was pouring through it with one of my best friends and the person that I talk to Anne about most, perhaps. We go on holiday quite regularly and just chat about Anne Boleyn for days and days, and go and situate ourselves in places that she once haunted. And this was a really, really special moment on a personal level. But it also really, really struck me, and you're so right to mention here, Natalie, that in lieu of that dedication page, which has been removed, really regrettably, this is, I agree, almost certainly the work of George Boleyn, who translated a number of different works for her, some of which do actually contain the dedication page, which make that explicit. But we can actually see throughout this book the same people employed as George commissioned. So I think the connection is a very, very strong one indeed. But seeing, as you mentioned, Natalie, the falcon, but not just the falcon, the honeysuckles and acorns, seeing the armillary sphere, one of her earliest emblems, recorded in the Book of Hours, the manuscript Book of Hours that we have at Hever Castle, and which she almost certainly drew alongside her signature before December 1529, because she signs her name Anne Boleyn and not Rochford or Pembroke or Queen. So this is one of her earliest emblems. It's sort of a complete record of her image. And one thing that really struck me is that we are perpetually fascinated by Anne's portraiture. And, one of the things that I'm most interested in, I think, is her portraiture. But this book compels us to rethink what was important to Anne. She could well have had a miniature of herself inserted into this. George could have inserted one of her. The Horham Boots did this. They could have put her allegorically into this book. Her face could have been recorded, but I don't think that was important to Anne Boleyn. What was important to her image was something much more profound. It was about familial roots. Of course, the white falcon is drawn from her butler ancestry. It's the Ormond emblem. And Anne adapts it as she becomes queen into her own symbol. So this is a really, really vital and important expression of the image that Anne wanted to project. And actually coming to that realization in its presence is a moment that I will never forget.
The reason we're talking about it now in February 2026 is because while this book is not often on display at Alnwick, it is going to be able to be seen by people for a very special exhibition that's just opened at Hever Castle. Owen, can you tell us about the new exhibition and the part that this book plays and what people will be able to see? Because I want to come all the way down from Alnwick to Hever just to see the book that is normally at Alnwick after hearing you two talk about it.
Oh, bless you. And I have to thank Natalie for coming all the way from Australia to join us for the opening of the exhibition as well, because I'm so excited about this one. And I'm also incredibly grateful to Alnwick for loaning us one of their absolute treasures for this exhibition. It's, to my knowledge, I've never seen this in an Anne Boleyn exhibition before, and to have it in a room where we're going to situate it alongside her manuscript book of hours, which I just alluded to, which contains an astrolabe drawn in her own hand, alongside some other key iconographic items that survive from her lifetime. We've got the beautiful falcon coming that Paul Fitzsimmons found, also a very rare display of her secondary emblem, the leopard head. We've got the Boleyn cup, which again bears her falcon, and we've got a beautiful missal box that survives from Anne's time. And this room is apart from the portraiture, but it's also speaking to it, because this exhibition is about Anne's image. It does contain over 30 portraits labelled as her, but it's also an opportunity to reflect, as I did in that beautiful archive office in Alnwick alongside Natalie, about what was important to Anne. And the room that people will be able to come into the presence of Ecclesiastes, perhaps for the first time in their life, will be a room of reflection on Anne's image, the image that she wished to project. So I'm enormously grateful that we're going to be able to include this book in the exhibition. I believe we're going to have it displayed throughout the exhibition on 4 different pages, so people will be able to see the variety of illuminations that were crafted by Gerard Horenbout for Anne. So I've dedicated years of my life to this exhibition. I'm so excited about it. We are going to put forward our best evidence for the contemporary portraiture of Anne Boleyn. But it's also an opportunity for people to let us know what they think about the evidence we've grouped together. So there will be an interactive element to this exhibition too. Are you looking forward to coming to see what we've been beavering over, Natalie?
Yes, I'm flying 21 hours to be there. So I'm probably the person coming from furthest away, I think. But I would not miss it for the world. I've watched how hard all of you, Owen and Kate, have worked on this, and Alison as well. I wouldn't miss it for the world. It's so exciting. I believe, Owen, that it's the most sort of Anne artifacts altogether, isn't it, in an exhibition? Unless I've made that up.
No, you're right.
Yeah, so that's tremendously exciting, and just I'm so happy that people are going to be able to see this beautiful manuscript as well. 4 pages of it, those illuminations we were talking about. Hopefully, feel something of that tangible connection to Anne and the Boleyns that we were talking about. Super excited.
So exciting.
If people want to find out more about that exhibition, Owen, where can they be redirected? And while we're talking about where people can find out more about Anne, Natalie, you mentioned your book. It'll be a fascinating read.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Yes, it's called The Final Year of Anne Boleyn, and the paperback came out recently. So the hardback was the end of 2022 and then paperback last year. And as I mentioned, I sort of touched on earlier, it is an account of the final 18 months, because I think that's all sort of crucial when we're trying to think about Anne's downfall. And, I'd love people to have a read and let me know what you think. I'm sort of on all the main social media channels. I'm also the host of the Talking Tudors podcast, run a wonderful Patreon community, so you can join me at any of those locations. I'd love to hear from you.
I would absolutely compel people to read Natalie's account of the last 18 months of Anne's life. It is perhaps one of the best examples of revisionist history rooted in acute reassessment of primary source material that I have ever read, and it entirely transformed my understanding of her final year on this earth. So please do read it. And in relation to our exhibition, it launched on the 11th of February at Hever Castle. You can find out all about it on the Hever Castle website. The title of the exhibition is Capturing a Queen, the Image of Anne Boleyn. And I was incredibly privileged to work alongside Kate McCaffrey to produce what is our 4th co-authored book of the same name on the exhibition, which is filled with, I think, over 120 images of Anne, and is reflective of a much wider study than we've able to cram in the 6 rooms of our exhibition. So there's so much there about Anne's portraiture, her image, and above all, the evolution of how people have understood her over the centuries. So I hope you enjoy.
Sorry, I was just saying, I think we've talked Daniel's ear off.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed that. That was so lovely.
Thank you both, Owen and Natalie, very much for joining us on this special Anne Boleyn themed episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast.
An absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Real pleasure. Thank you.
It was great to hear all about Anne Boleyn, her connections with the Percys, and her copy of the Ecclesiastes from Natalie and Owen. You can find Natalie's podcast Talking Tudors on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the Podbean app, and you can follow Owen on Instagram at Dr. Owen Emmerson, where you'll also find links to his website and books. And of course, you'll be able to see Alnwick Castle's prayer book on display in the Capturing a Queen exhibition at Hever Castle this year. Visit their website for more details. For more Tudors on the Alnwick Castle podcast, head into our back catalogue and look for episode 65, where we speak to Nicola Tallis about the young Elizabeth I, or episode 44, focusing on Tudor music, or episode 41, where we give our own perspective on the story of Anne Boleyn and the 6th Earl of Northumberland. And look out for more Boleyn-related content coming to the podcast in the very near future. We'll be back next month with another episode, but until then, I've been Daniel. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.